The Great Sphinx of Egypt is a cultural monument that has existed in human memory for what feels like forever. But how old is it really? According to Wikipedia, the Sphinx is the oldest known monumental sculpture in Egypt and one of the most recognizable statues in the world. The archaeological evidence suggests that it was created by ancient Egyptians of the Old Kingdom during the reign of Khafre, between 2558 and 2532 BC. But today we will be destroying this view. Welcome to Shaman Vision. John Anthony West, an independent Egyptologist, recognized that the Great Sphinx seems older than history teaches us. He consulted geologist Dr. Robert Schoch, professor of natural sciences at Boston University, to investigate this idea. Dr. Robert Schoch has this to say about the dating of the Sphinx.
The Sphinx is something I have been working on now for over a quarter century. I am a PhD from Yale. I'm a geologist, geophysicist PhD from Yale. I now teach at Boston University. I started at Boston University in 1984. I started working on the Sphinx in 1990. And the person that introduced me to the Sphinx was this man, John Anthony West. People began in about 1990 working on the Sphinx. At that time, the paradigm was that we were hunter-gatherers, very primitive. Then people became barbarians, and ultimately civilization arose about 3500 BC. And that was the standard paradigm, the standard worldview at the time for these things, and that the Sphinx was built about 2500 BC. And one of the characteristics of civilization as it was defined was monumental stone structures. I found very quickly, 25 years ago, that geology shows there is a problem with this dating. That the Sphinx, and I will talk about this in a second, sits on the edge of the Sahara Desert. It's been hyper-arid desert for the last 5,000 years, back to 3000 BC, essentially all of alleged history of civilization. Now, I'm a geologist, and what I studied, these are people for scale. You can see how the Sphinx was carved out of the bedrock, and I studied initially the weathering, the erosion on the Sphinx and on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure. And what I found very early on is that you look at this weathering and erosion, this was caused by rain, by water coming down, not what you expect in a desert condition. So this said to me right away as a geologist that there was something wrong here with the dating. That the dating had to go back to a period when it was pre-Sahara. Here you can see diagrammatically what you get with the rain erosion versus the wind erosion. There are layers of rock, and in both cases it takes out the softer layers, but with a very different style, a very different weathering pattern. Here we can see real photographs. This is the Sphinx enclosure. This is the wall of the Sphinx enclosure. This is wind erosion on the Giza Plateau of Old Kingdom structures that, according to Egyptologists, are approximately within a century or two the same age as this. But this doesn't make sense geologically. This has to be older to an earlier climatic period. Here we see the same thing here. This is the wind features. Notice how it's very angular, looks very different than the rolling, undulating features that are caused by water, caused by precipitation. Here we see exactly the same thing, just to give you a sense of what is caused by rain. And what I concluded very early on is that this Great Sphinx dates back to an earlier climatic period, not 2500 BC, but my initial estimate was at least 5,000 to 7,000 or earlier. Had to go back to this earlier period where it was much more rainy, much more moist, much more temperate before the onset of the desert period. And it had to go back enough in time to cause this massive erosion, to cause this massive weathering.
So now we scientifically know that the Sphinx dates back to at least 7,000 BC, which would be around 9,000 years ago. Let's keep going.
Independent investigators aren't surprised. John West has some daring theories of his own about the Sphinx, starting with its head.
Now you look at the head, you see that it's in much better condition than the body. Even though the head is cut of a much harder limestone, the difference between the condition of the head and the condition of the body is extreme. Perhaps even more important, the head is disproportionately small. Seen especially from the air, you see that the body of the Sphinx is long and flattened out, and the head almost looks like a pinhead stuck on the top of it. This, to us, is an indication that the head has been recarved. In other words, the head is not original to the Sphinx. At some point in its long history, the head was redone.
The investigators also think that the Giza Plateau is a map of the stars as they appeared in the skies in 10,500 BC. Graham Hancock explains.
Standing at Giza, the ancient astronomers faced an uninterrupted 360-degree horizon, which invited observations of the rising points of the sun and the stars. Another direction also drew their attention, the north-south line dividing the sky directly above their heads, and they observed the stars as they crossed this line. In 10,500 BC, when the three stars of Orion's belt crossed this line, they did so in a pattern that is exactly matched by the pattern of the three pyramids on the ground.
The Sphinx, they believe, is actually an astronomical marker of the vernal equinox, but not in 2500 BC when the Sphinx was supposedly built.
When the Sphinx is supposed to have been built, 2500 BC, the sun rose in the constellation of Taurus. It would have been utterly absurd for a pharaoh to have built an equinoctial marker in the form of a lion in that epoch. In fact, there's only one epoch when it would have been appropriate for the Sphinx to have been built in the form that it has. That was the age of Leo, beginning in the 11th millennium BC.
Every 2,000 years or so, a different constellation appears behind the sun and a new astrological age begins. The last time there was an age of Leo was 12,000 years ago. Robert Bovel explains.
At this special time in 10,500 BC, the sun would rise due east, directly in line with the Sphinx, at the rising of the constellation of Leo. Here comes the constellation of Leo breaking over the horizon. And here is the sun. So it's at this time, at the age of Leo, that the Sphinx would be gazing at its own image in the sky.
But if that isn't enough, there's more. Why is the Sphinx offset to the right of the main east-west axis of this pyramid, and why is that causeway sloping to the south of east? The ancient pyramid builders did nothing by chance. So what's the significance of this curious offset?
The computer has the answer. It shows us that this is the place where the sun would rise exactly in the direction of the causeway, 14 degrees to the right, in perfect alignment with the causeway. Now what we have here, to the left is the constellation of Leo. And as we can see, it's half buried below the horizon, with its head and shoulders sticking out. And this is what they saw when they looked in the east. The sun rising along the direction of the causeway, and to the left, the Sphinx. half buried in the sand, with its head and shoulders sticking out of the sand, in the same way that the constellation of Leo would be seen rising over the horizon with its head and shoulders sticking over the horizon line.
The Sphinx and the pyramids link up to form a gigantic astronomical hologram of the skies above Egypt around the year 10,500 BC. In that epoch, and only in that epoch, the key celestial bodies are represented with faultless accuracy, viewed from every conceivable angle and direction. When we remember the uncanny precision with which the pyramid builders worked, it's impossible to ascribe such interlocking complexity to coincidence. What we have here is a massive and deliberate time marker for the epoch of 10,500 BC, almost 8,000 years before Egyptian civilization is supposed to have begun.
Other evidence supports that date, especially the erosion on the Sphinx. John West believes it was caused not by sand, but by water. He says the evidence was there all along.
Well, nobody was looking for it. It's a bit like if you're looking for potatoes, you can walk right through a field full of diamonds and see a lot of nasty glittering stones. So the geology was simply taken for granted. Nobody looked for it, nobody found it.
West's conclusion is based on the Sphinx's extremely distinctive pattern of weathering.
You don't even have to be a geologist to look at it and see what must have been responsible for that kind of weathering. Only water pouring in sheets over the enclosure wall could have produced those rounded contours.
Though the age of any stone is difficult to determine, a history of the rock can be constructed by looking at the characteristics of its erosion. When stone is exposed to wind and sand, the telltale sign is that the layers appear soft and scoured out. This kind of erosion is found everywhere in Giza. But the Sphinx and its surrounding pit are worn differently. These show a different kind of erosion altogether, a round, undulating profile, usually caused by rainwater and torrential downpours. When confronted with this evidence, Egyptologists theorized that the flooding of the Nile could have caused the damage. West disagrees.
No, absolutely not, because the Nile floods would come in from the bottom, and if it had been flooding by Nile waters, you'd have a different pattern of erosion. You'd have the walls undercut. In other words, you'd have the deepest erosion at the bottom, not at the top. And you also wouldn't get those deep fissures.
West's discovery raised many questions. In a debate, geologists sided with West. Egyptologists have offered few replies to his conclusions. Journalist Paul Roberts covered the controversy.
West is really an academic's worst nightmare, because here comes somebody way out of left field with a thoroughly well thought out, well presented, coherently described, beautifully written, full of data you can't refute, and it pulls the rug from beneath your feet. So how do they deal with it? They ignore it. They hope it'll go away. And it won't go away.
Even if the repairs were done because of water damage, a major question is still unanswered. When was there water in the desert? The answer is surprising. At the end of the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago.
This was a time in the history of mankind when the earth was passing through an unprecedented upheaval. A tremendous cataclysm was taking place in the earth 12,500 years ago. This was the end of the last ice age. There had been 50 or 60,000 years of relatively stable conditions, with millions of square miles of ice covering the northern hemisphere. And suddenly, for reasons that no scientist has yet fully fathomed out, all of this ice melted in a span of just 2,000 to 3,000 years.
The ice cap that covered northern Europe and America back then was 2 miles thick. The melting was sudden and widespread. and created floods of biblical proportions. West and his fellow investigators point to another structure they believe could date to 10,000 BC. It too shows unmistakable signs of being weathered by vast amounts of water. It's the Osiren at Abydos. It was found early in the 20th century, buried under sand.
Here, some 500 miles south of Giza, at the Osirion, we find ourselves amidst another of those enigmatic, anonymous structures that seem to date to no known epoch. 50 feet or more below the floor of surrounding pharaonic temples. Is it possible that this is just one amongst many structures like this buried beneath the sands of Egypt? Later pharaohs came and added their reliefs to these walls, but originally this structure was anonymous and bare, left for future generations to interpret.
Those who hold unorthodox views about the Giza Plateau find further confirmation in the Egyptian creation myth, what the ancients called the first time. Bobble explains.
Every civilization refers to a creation myth, a beginning. But the Egyptians were extremely clear about what had happened in the beginning. They tell us the earth was totally covered with water, and that the physical, the material earth sprang out of the water, and we had a primeval mound on which creation began, on which there was the first dawn, the first sunrise. It's as if, for example, the king who built those pyramids was reenacting that moment, that time of the gods. It would be normal for them to want to commemorate it, to freeze it, if you like, in a grandiose expression. I think if there is the original primeval mound, that's it, Giza. Indeed, the texts refer to the place of Giza, of Heliopolis, as being the location of creation. Perhaps we should take them literally. They tell us that this is the place of creation. And what else we would expect of that fantastic moment of creation than monuments of this sort to commemorate it?
What's at issue here is the entire history of civilization. It may not have gone in a straight line from stupid old cavemen to smart old us with our hydrogen bombs and our striped toothpaste.
So long ago, what do you think was their primary purpose, especially in relation to the very ancient sites like Göbekli Tepe?
Actually, it's almost an impossible question to answer, because nobody knows why they built them. That they have this emotional power, particularly the Sphinx, is unmistakable. Gurdjieff used to say, when asked about the Sphinx, that it was a symbol of an esoteric society. My guess is, but it's only a guess, but maybe you might say it's an informed guess, that it symbolizes the animal body. It symbolizes the age of Leo. The lion's body symbolizes man as, flesh and blood, as the animal. And then the head, the human head, which is almost certainly recarved at some later date, might have been altogether a lion to begin with and a symbol of Leo. It could also be, when in its recarved state, the human head representing human potential to divinize, in other words, to become, in Egyptian terminology, a star and sail, join the company of Ra and sail across the sky with him in his boat of millions of years. It's a lovely way to put the idea of immortality. It's not impossible, as fusion of lion and man, that it symbolizes the the Leo Aquarius axis, because Aquarius is associated with humanity. It's the water pourer, and Leo, of course, is the lion. So some combination of all of those things as a ballpark guess, but since the Egyptians themselves clearly didn't really know what the Sphinx was for, it only comes into the Egyptian texts in the New Kingdom around 1300 or so, that is well over 1,000 years from the time it was supposed to have been carved, and we're of course convinced that it's carved tens of thousands of years earlier. So nobody knows what it really was for, but you might say Egypt is a one-issue civilization. Its one single aim is the quest for immortality, the potential of humanity to become a god, literally, in the true sense of that word. So the Sphinx fulfills that role, or let's say best guess is that the Sphinx is there to further that quest. Beyond that, nobody really knows enough to say anything specifically, but given the Egyptian doctrine, that's consistent with it.
But with the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, now kind of, like you said, it's like the smoking gun.
Yeah, that is the smoking gun, Göbekli Tepe. The reason being, when we did the water weathering of the Sphinx, that it's thousands of years older, the opposition said, well, how can that be? It's all hunter-gatherers back then. You don't know what you're talking about. The hell with the geology. We don't care. Along comes Göbekli Tepe, which the archaeologists, date to 10,000 BC and maybe even earlier. So that's the smoking gun, because they can't argue that it's a bunch of primitives that produce this whole acreage of interlocked, closely adjacent, major stone circles. So there's no argument with this anymore.
And it's almost like there could be more stuff buried under the ground.
Oh, definitely. Oh, right. Göbekli Tepe is an instance. I mean, that was rediscovered by accident because it was deliberately covered up. So if other sites are deliberately covered up, there's much more to be found.
Now it's understood, scientifically, that the Sphinx is much older than we were taught in school. Mainstream academia still struggles to admit these facts. I wonder why that is. As we enter step by step into our study, the greater do we realize that the quote-unquote ministers of our modern educational system seem to have something to hide. Thanks for watching. Peace.